So let's hop straight into what emotional eating is. So emotional eating is any time you really eat something when you're not hungry. And this can happen because of anything. So this is 100% normal. We all emotionally eat. So I don't want you to feel bad about that in the first place. But how this kind of comes about is we actually have this space where, since we were babies, we were given food the minute we cried. And that was usually our parents just trying to eliminate, like going through a process of elimination. So they would first, almost one of the first things they would give us is food when we cried. However, you know, we at the time might not have been hungry, but we were feeling an emotion that we couldn't identify with. And the solution we were provided by our primary caregiver is food. And mostly back then it was in the form of milk. It's beautiful, comforting, warm. It just made us feel absolutely comforted. And then we kind of forget about the emotion that we were feeling because all of a sudden we have this comfort. So we go through life being comforted with food as we grow up, you know, so we like sometimes we rewarded if we finished our food plates, or you know, there could be times where you were rewarded with an ice cream if you did well on your report card. But we also start going through spaces where we get rewarded or we use food in celebrations. So when it's birthdays, you know, like so often you're at a birthday party, you might have had a beautiful dinner, and then all of a sudden you'll keep eating even though there's cake. You'll start eating the cake, and that's not because you're hungry, it's because you part of this celebration. So yeah, basically this is just such a beautiful space to be in, where we can understand that emotional eating happens and is normal. But if you are starting to lead into feeling guilty about emotional eating, if you're starting to lean into spaces where you just feel like this is just taking over your life, then this is where emotional eating becomes a problem. If you find yourself every night after dinner, you know, walking into the closet and, you know, eating that ice cream or eating whatever happens, then, you know, this is where we really start looking at, like, why has emotional eating become such a massive part of your life? So usually what happens is we have this trigger that causes us to emotionally eat. And that's usually something that makes us feel uncomfortable. And this can be anything. This could be you know, you feel alone, or you feel awkward, you know, like, so usually if you find yourself at the snack table at birthday parties or networking events or anything like that, it's probably because you're wanting that comfort of something, and you know food has helped provide you with comfort somewhere along the line. So this is where we start. We have this trigger that happens. For me, one of my biggest triggers was always loneliness. So my husband would travel for work, and I would be fine for the first 2 days, and then all of a sudden something will just happen and it will trigger a binge. So that's just how things kind of start, is with something that triggers you, whether it's an event or a habit or an emotion or hunger. So I talk about this a lot in some of my other talks, where hunger is probably one of our biggest triggers. So we go through our day with, we forget to eat, or we've been too restrictive, and then we get this trigger. Our body's going through overwhelm or anxiety because we haven't eaten, and then all we can think about is eat. So next what happens is we've got this trigger that happens. I'm going to use loneliness for an example, or boredom. So we feel lonely, and then all of a sudden we can't sit with that feeling. It's uncomfortable. And that's when an urge will pop up. Now, an urge can be, usually it's in thought, but it can also be a sensation that you feel in your body. So how this usually presents is a thought that comes up and goes, you know what, it might not say I'm lonely, because it won't identify with that. It will just go, you know what, you deserve that chocolate in the cupboard, because, you know, you've been good all week. And I think you will just really, this will really benefit you right now. And that is how the urge starts. And then as we lean into that, you know, like there's something that listens to it. And as we give that a little bit of attention, the thoughts start becoming louder and louder. Now, sometimes an urge is not a thought. Sometimes the urge is just a habit. So the habit could be that you've come from a place where every day at 3 o'clock you have a chocolate. And eventually your body becomes dependent, and your mind becomes so dependent on the comfort you get from that piece of chocolate at 3 p.m. that you actually, that becomes the urge. It's like, oh, it's 3 o'clock, time for my chocolate, if that makes sense. Other forms of urge can also be in sensations. So for me, sometimes an urge will actually show up in my throat or my mouth as either extra saliva, or actually my jaw would clench quite a bit back in the day, especially if I was starting to think about something that was forbidden on my food list. So then I'd get this real like achy feeling in my body, and that actually adds to the urgency of getting rid of that. And like my body knows out of habit or out of, you know, previous behavior, that the only thing that's going to get me out of that uncomfortable feeling is to eat. And now you're in the space where all of a sudden your thoughts have overpowered you. All you want to do is get rid of that, and you want to hop into a space where you can just eat. And all of a sudden it almost feels like your brain switches off. You know, a lot of my clients talks about this, where they just feel like they can't, something just happens and they go into this like altered state. And this is where we tend to overeat, and this is where we tend to not realize that that full block of chocolate on my own is too rich and I'm feeling sick. You don't feel that in the moment, because it's almost like your body distracts you, and that's all you zoned in on. And obviously, naturally, what happens afterwards, especially if you've just eaten the whole family block of chocolates, is we have this guilt that pops into our minds. And this is also our subconscious knows that we're going to feel guilty, and she takes advantage of that. She rubs it in real hard, because she knows that you are possibly going to be eating again because of the guilt, because the guilt then becomes a trigger. So it becomes this vicious circle where we actually wake up in the morning feeling guilty for what we've eaten last night, and that's all you can think about. And the next minute you have this urge, and then you eat. Then you feel guilty again, so you try and make up for it with like thinking about, you know, you put in your calories into MyFitnessPal, or you, you know, obsess in the mind about how you're going to be good today and not eat any of those foods. And the next minute, you know, you're halfway down a whole pack of chips or like 2 donuts, and you're like, what happened? Like, I've just like lost 20 minutes of my life and it was while I was eating. So, you know, like one of my clients literally would wake up in the middle of the night. Actually, she wasn't really awake. She would wake up in the middle of the night in the kitchen where she has finished a whole box of squares or a whole box of chips or bickies or whatever. And she's like, I don't understand how this happens. I went to bed, and then like I wake up, and it's not like I woke up and walked to the kitchen. I wake up in the kitchen already having eaten all this food. And we had to really work hard on where that came from. And like one of her biggest triggers was hunger. She was, she actually had another disorder, being very restrictive with her food intake. And this is what was causing her to subliminally or subconsciously eat in the middle of the night. So, and yeah, this is what can happen, So just bearing this in mind when you think about emotional eating and how it can affect you. And all of a sudden when you think, well, I'm emotionally eating again, I don't understand, I'm not feeling any emotion, it's probably just because of the previous guilt or whatever you felt before. So basically, where do we get these where does emotional eating come from, or what are the main triggers we need to look out for? Mainly, stress is one of the biggest things that cause emotional eating, whether you feel stressed on a conscious level or whether that's deep down subconsciously. And basically, we produce this stress hormone called cortisol, and cortisol actually stimulates cravings for foods that will give us energy. So cortisol is our fight or flight hormone, and that prepares the body for war or battle or attack from that, ancient tiger back when we were in the caveman days. And we are in a space where, it just gets to a point where we are so bombarded with cortisol because our whole lives is in stress mode. We don't give ourselves the time to process what's happened to us during the day. We don't allow ourselves to feel emotions when they come up. Like, if you had to think really, when was the last time you actually allowed yourself to be okay with being bored without trying to distract yourself with either food or watching television, or, when was the last time you were okay with actually just taking 5 to 10 minutes to do a stress relieving exercise? And most of the time, those stress relieving exercises are very quiet, and it requires you to be with yourself. And that's uncomfortable for us. So we live in this world where we've created, we almost addicted now to stress. But what happens is the cortisol triggers cravings for especially salty and sweet foods. So these are normally the foods that you will feel guilty over after eating. The next thing is ignoring emotions, as I've just talked about. So we can do that in a couple of ways. Like, most of it is distraction techniques, where we either drink, or we, in emotional eating perspective, we eat to avoid that emotion because we feel that quick bit of comfort. However, if you don't deal with what's going on for you with that emotion, our bodies are very clever. They're like, oh, okay, you don't have time to deal with this anger right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to store it somewhere for you in the body. And then later, when you are a little bit alone, or when you are bored, that's a perfect time for you to feel that feeling again, because now you have time for it. And that's why we often feel emotions in the body. Like, you can feel it in your stomach, you can feel it in the throat, you feel it in your heart. And the thing about emotions is it only takes about 90 seconds to 2 minutes to actually process an emotion and let it go. But if you don't, as I said, the body will store it for you for later. The same as it does with excess food. If we don't finish our plate of, or if we eat too much and the body's like, oh, hang on, what do I do with all this extra stuff? It stores it in the body, in the fat cells, for later. Same with emotions. It's not like it just disappears when we distract ourselves with silly things. Then boredom or feelings of emptiness. So boredom and loneliness, and that space of emptiness is very uncomfortable. We don't like that because that kind of feels like in those times we almost have to deal with what we're feeling, but it just kind of makes us feel so uncomfortable that it would just be so much better to do something and distract ourselves. And the way to do that is through finding something to eat, you know. And that's probably some of the times when you'll find yourself in the refrigerator not knowing what you're doing there. You're like standing in the refrigerator staring blankly in there, and you're like, Stell, what am I doing here? Has that happened to you? So, and that's where that comes from. And then obviously last one, like I talked about, is habits. So I mentioned this earlier, where you actually at 3 p.m. every day, you've had that chocolate for a week or two. It doesn't take long to form a eating habit. So a week or two of eating that sugar at 3 p.m., all of a sudden the body's like, yep, it's like 10 to 3, time for my chocolate. Like, where is it? And it's going to make you think about that chocolate until you have something sweet or to get through that craving. So basically, how do we identify whether our hunger or the eating that we're going through is actually emotional or physical? So first of all, we go through a space of understanding that there's going to be an urge, like we talked about, to eat. Sometimes, you know, we only think of urges as negative, but sometimes when you are hungry, those are all cues or urges to fulfill your hunger. It's not bad. It's just your body saying, hey, it's time for a meal. I need a snack. But there is definitely a difference between emotional and physical hunger. So physical hunger will come on slowly. So you might like feel like a couple of indications that, oh, you know, a snack could be good now, but then you kind of carry on with work, and an hour later you're like, oh, okay, now it's really time. I'm going to get hangry if I don't go and, you know, prepare my salad or whatever you're doing. Whereas emotional hunger comes on so quick. It like switches on, and all of a sudden you are just in a space where it's like, oh my God, I just have to eat. And the second thing about emotional hunger is it's like, I need a chocolate, or I need that donut. That's like, I'm going to die if I don't have that donut. Like, that's how it feels. So it's very, very persuasive. It's non-negotiable on what you want to eat. Whereas physical hunger would be like, oh yeah, I can do with anything right now. Like, I can have an apple, or, and that's actually a good test to check whether you're hungry, is like when those thoughts pop up, like, and it's like going into more of the emotional specs, is asking yourself, how about an apple? And if your body says, yes, I'll have an apple, then you know that's physical hunger. But if it's like, oh, hell no, I want that donut, then you know emotional eating is like that thought, that urge is an emotional one. Another way to tell that is, you know, physical hunger is felt in the stomach, whereas emotional hunger all starts from here, because it's not really a real physical hunger. We're sitting in the brain space, and that's why, but it feels so urgent from the neck up, and that's why you'll get all these like kind of crunches in the jaw, or your mouth will just water excessively, like out of like for no reason. You might get a bit headachy, but also you'll have blinding thoughts of food all the time, and that's when you know. And also, these thoughts are not like, oh, you know, you can go have like, how about we have a muffin later? It's not like that. It's like, oh my God, like seriously, Stell, like muffin right now, or something really bad is going to happen. So it's always going to try and convince you that you're going to die, or something bad is going to happen if you don't have that specific food right now. And it knows you will react to that, because that's the reaction that we would normally react to. When we're in that space, we produce even more cortisol, bit of adrenaline, and it's like it gets us to move.